Walter Isaacson is the author of a new biography simply titled Leonardo da Vinci. You might know him from his best-selling biographies of luminaries like Steve Jobs, Albert Einstein, and Benjamin Franklin. And now, Walter Isaacson joins me in Toronto. Hi, how are you?
Hey, it's great to be here in Toronto again, in the studio again.
It's nice to have you back. So the Salvator Mundi breaks records, the highest price ever paid for a piece of art at an auction. Why is there still so much interest in the work of Leonardo da Vinci?
I think it shows the allure of Leonardo da Vinci after 500 years. You know, if you look at Salvator Mundi, one of the interesting scientific things is that the blessing hand of Jesus is sharply delineated, unlike the face and everything else, which are slightly blurred, which is the way Leonardo did most things. And it's as if the hand is coming off of the panel, out of the mystery, and getting very close to your eyes. And in some ways, that's a metaphor for Leonardo. He's reaching out after 500 years from the mysteries of the past, and he almost feels like he still touches us.
There are less than 20 Leonardo da Vinci paintings in the world. Why?
He was a procrastinator.
Is that so?
If he didn't think a painting was perfect, he didn't finish it, like Steve Jobs, who held up shipping the original Macintosh until he could make the circuit board inside beautiful. So there's some paintings Leonardo started, like Adoration of the Magi, and he just couldn't make them right. And it was also because he loved everything. He loved anatomy and flying machines and engineering and waterworks. And some, art historians say it's such a shame he was so interested in all those things. Otherwise, he could have focused on his paintings and painted more. Maybe. And maybe he would have been a great master painter, but he wouldn't have been Leonardo da Vinci. He wouldn't have been a genius, and he wouldn't have gotten to the Mona Lisa. I think it took being distracted by everything that nature offers to give him that fullness that made him such a genius.
I had no idea that Leonardo da Vinci and I had so much in common.
Right. I have lessons from Leonardo is the last chapter of my book, and one of them is every now and then procrastinate.
Yeah. I don't need too many lessons on that.
Yeah.
So much of your book looks at Leonardo's private notebooks. His personal notebooks. Tell me a little bit about those. What's in those?
We're so lucky that after 500 years, we still have more than 7,200 pages of his notebooks that you can look at. They're all over in beautiful places. They're in Venice and Florence and Milan and Rome and Paris and London. And you can see his mind dancing with nature on every page because he'll start off doing sketches of people's expressions and trying to show how facial expressions connect to certain emotions. But then he'll do a swirl of a river and a curl of hair and figure out the math of a spiral and how it works. And then he'll move on to show a law of tree branching or how you would square the circle. Or he'll do an anatomy, the fetus in the womb or the neck muscles or something. So on every page, there's just all sorts of things he's interested in, including a whole list of questions that he'll write, like figure out why the sky is blue, or figure out why water swirls when it hits an obstacle. Well, and those wonderful curiosity.
What does that tell you about who he was as a person?
He was lucky to have been born out of wedlock because otherwise he would have had to be a notary like his dad and granddad. And so he becomes a self-taught person who is totally, infinitely curious about everything that crosses his eye. Now, we're that way when we were young. Most kids are curious, but somehow we lose it or we get it beaten out of us by, grown-ups who say, quit asking so many dumb questions. The thing about Leonardo is he doesn't outgrow his wonder years. He still fantasizes when he's an older man. He still asks questions like, describe the tongue of the woodpecker, or why is the sky blue? And those are things we can try to be more like. We can say, all right, I'm just going to be a little bit more observant. Sometimes, fantasize a bit more and also be more curious.
Here's what I found really interesting about your book is that when I was coming up making art and playing music, you were either a science-minded person or you were an arts-minded person, and never the two shall meet.
Yeah.
But we learned from Leonardo that you can be both. And in fact, it was one that helped the other.
Yes. Steve Jobs used to end his product presentations by showing a slide of the intersection of the arts and technology. He said, if you can stand at that intersection, that's where creativity happens. That's why the iPod or iPhone is something of such beauty, not just of good engineering. And so Steve Jobs, was among those who urged me to write about Leonardo because he's the ultimate person who connects the humanities, the arts, the sciences, engineering. And he doesn't really make much of a distinction between them. If you look at Vitruvian Man, the nude guy doing jumping jacks in the circle
this
in the
guy right here,
square,
with their arms outstretched. Yeah.
exactly. That is a work of great anatomical scientific precision. It's also a beautiful piece of math, of squaring the circle. It also is very spiritual, which is, here I am standing in the center of the earth, the center of the cosmos, in creation, saying, how do I fit in? And it's also an amazing work of art, with the left-handed hatchings doing the beautiful body, the intense stare. So I think everything of Leonardo, from the Mona Lisa to the anatomy drawings, are works of both art and science. And that's a big lesson in the book, which is, don't force yourself down one path.
Yeah.
I mean, you're a musician, you've been an artist. Well, look at the beauties of science.
Mm-hmm.
A scientific fact is just as beautiful of a brushstroke as a brushstroke in a painting.
In retrospect, I think I may have just been trying to excuse my poor math grades.
Yeah,
well, no,
sure.
I'm not good at the Pythagorean theorem. I'm good at the piano.
Well, if we're going to make sure we can stand at that intersection, those of us who love the humanities have to say, all right, I'm going to make a little extra effort to figure out why math is beautiful. And those who are the engineers and coders and mathematicians, when Einstein gets stumped doing the equations for general relativity, he pulls out his violin and plays Mozart because he says it connects him to the harmonies of the spheres. So we each should try to cross the divide.
I think when we think about Da Vinci, or if you're listening to this right now and you think about Da Vinci, you might just think, you might think about the Mona Lisa. You might not know that too much about the man himself. What was fascinating about your book is that something important happens around his 30th birthday. What happens?
He decides to leave Florence. He's gotten a couple of paintings he hasn't finished, like Adoration of the Magi. His father had been the notary for the contracts, which...
Is the Mona Lisa in this situation by now?
No. Mona Lisa is one of his final paintings by his deathbed. Oh. So this is when he's young, in his 20s. He's a 20-something, not finishing some of his work, getting his father probably annoyed because his father had notarized the contracts. And he decides to become part of a delegation going to Milan. And he goes as a musician because he's invented musical instruments, because he loves how sound waves work. So he's part of this delegation, and he writes the coolest job application letter in history, which is to the Duke of Milan. It's 11 paragraphs long, and the first 10 paragraphs are about engineering. It's about, I can build great buildings, I can make weapons of war, I can divert the course of rivers, and then there's some science in there. Only in the 11th paragraph does he say, I can also paint and sculpt as well as any person. And I think that just shows, first of all, him wanting to expand his horizons, but also that he didn't want to just be one thing. He wanted to try to learn everything possible about everything knowable, and he wanted to have a feel for every aspect of creation, including how we fit into it.
I want to quote you here. You described Da Vinci as, quote, illegitimate, gay, vegetarian, left-handed, easily distracted, and at times heretical. That's a big description. There's a lot in there. How did his status as, we'll say, an outsider, especially of that time, how did that shape his creative life?
Well, he was very lucky because he goes to Florence, and Florence is a deeply tolerant live and let live city, which is why in the late 1400s it becomes a cradle of the Renaissance. All sorts of people coming in from Constantinople, which had just fallen. They're bringing math from the Arab world. People like Leonardo coming in from rural areas because they're misfits. As Steve Jobs would say, here's to the misfits, the rebels, the round pegs in the square hole, the ones who think different. And Leonardo was deeply comfortable with that. He had a male companion. He dressed in a very, sort of colorful way. He was deeply popular in Florence. Everybody loved him. And so I think it's one of the lessons of creativity is you have to have a whole mix of people and be comfortable with all sorts of people.
But I didn't know this. He was also arrested for having sex with a man, right?
Right. He was arrested for sodomy once, but he had the good fortune to be arrested along with him, a member of the Medici family, which was the ruling family of Florence at the time, Lorenzo the Medici. So if you ever get arrested, just make sure it's with somebody from the most important family in town. And so he doesn't go to trial. It's dismissed. And it shows back then, and by the way, it's true even today, sort of mixed feelings of things like being gay and having male companions was very tolerated at the time, yet there were still laws against sodomy. So he grows up as an outsider, knows he's an outsider, but he's secure enough to just be comfortable with who he is.
But you get this feeling that changed his art a little bit, right? I mean, he's freeing birds.
Yeah.
He's drawing versions of prison cells, right?
Right. And he's sort of has all these friends who are very, different fields, mathematicians and architects and all. And so they're bringing together the different disciplines that help art have things like not just beautiful brushstrokes, but mathematical perspective so that they look three-dimensional on a two-dimensional plane. So you see this birth of all sorts of creativity happening then.
But what's with the freeing caged birds part?
Well, he was a vegetarian, as you mentioned. He does anatomy experiments on both humans, he dissects some cadavers, and then animals. And he discovers that animals have a nervous system, especially larger animals. He's able to trace the nerves to the spinal cord. And so he writes in his notebook that they have feelings. They feel pain. They have, a conscious feelings. And so he decides, well, maybe I should buy the birds that are caged and people are going to eat and free them and watch how they're going to fly. And he becomes a vegetarian.
If you're just tuning in, you're listening to Q. I'm speaking with Walter Isaacson about his new book, Leonardo da Vinci. Back home where I'm from in Newfoundland, there's this newspaper called The Telegram, and oftentimes it says, like, who would you want to sit down and have a dinner party with? You'll see, and people say Shakespeare or like my mother, and more often than not, Leonardo da Vinci
of course.
comes up.
He's the right answer.
What kind of dinner party guest would he be?
Well, he'd be wonderful because he's interested in everything, and he's curious about everything, and you'd be probably hours at dinner and slightly exhausted at the end, because if you knew anything about how the eye saw light waves, he would grill you about it. Or if you knew anything about scuba diving gear, which he helped invent, he would say, okay, how would you have the breathing apparatus? He would just be interested in everything. And even though I said he was a vegetarian, and he gave a lot of dinner parties. Since we have his notebooks, we have his shopping list. We know that he served, he would not be one of those dinner companions that I can't believe you're going to eat that, because he did allow both fowl and seafood to be served at his table.
Even though
he's a vegetarian.
Right.
Yeah. In fact, if you look at The Last Supper, they just restored it. And I think one of his favorite dishes, even though he's a vegetarian, was eel with citrus. And I suspect he had dissected an eel and come to the conclusion that maybe it doesn't have a central nervous system, so maybe I can indulge in eel and shellfish.
Walter, throughout this conversation, you've been referencing Steve Jobs. You've obviously famously wrote a biography of Steve Jobs. And what connections do you see between Leonardo da Vinci and Steve Jobs?
Well, Steve's wonderful advertisement he wrote, "Here's to the misfits, the rebels around pegs in a square hole." I think Steve Jobs felt of himself as a rebel and an outsider. He also felt he stood at the intersection of the humanities, the arts, engineering, and science. He was also boundlessly curious. Having dinner with Steve Jobs, he was also a vegetarian, but having dinner with Steve Jobs was sort of like with Leonardo. By the end of the dinner, he's raised questions on everything from human migration, 2 million years ago, to exactly how a circuit board could look more beautiful if you did it a certain way. I think you see that in Ben Franklin, another biography subject I wrote. I sort of have an affection for people who like to know different things about different fields, and then with almost a fingertip feel, can feel the patterns of nature.
So you start seeing patterns. You start seeing your own patterns between all of these people: Albert Einstein, Benjamin Franklin, Leonardo da Vinci, Steve Jobs, right?
Right. The pattern is they're not just smart people, because on your show you've probably had so many smart people, and often they don't amount to much. What matters is being a creative and imaginative person. So what makes somebody imaginative? And one of the themes I've tried to explore is, if you are interested in many different disciplines, you begin to see patterns. Leonardo's famous favorite was the spiral. He loved how water spiraled, hair spiraled, wind spiraled. He did a little bit of the math of the spiral. So whether it's the Mona Lisa or his dissection of the heart valve, showing how the spiraling of the blood opens the heart valve, Leonardo's understanding of patterns like spirals helps make him creative in different fields.
We're seeing that Paramount won the rights to adapt your book for film. It's being announced that another Leonardo DiCaprio will be produced as well as star in the biopic. How are you feeling about it? Do you think it's
Well,
gonna
I
be
think
good?
that'd be great. I know nothing about Hollywood. I
Yeah.
only know what I've read in the papers. I do feel, so I have no idea how they're proceeding. I do feel that Leonardo DiCaprio is somebody who cares about nature, cares about the environment, cares about science. He, like Leonardo da Vinci, of course, loved theater. I mean, Leonardo da Vinci spent a lot of his time as a theater producer, and Leonardo DiCaprio also loves art. I saw somewhere that he went and saw Salvador Mundi before it was sold. So I can't think of anybody who'd be much better at adapting the life of Leonardo da Vinci.
What's it like seeing your research on screen?
It's sometimes uncomfortable.
Really?
I mean, both Steve Jobs, Albert Einstein, Ben Franklin, even I did a book years ago on Henry Kissinger. It's been adapted on screen. And when I say I don't know Hollywood or understand it that well, the Leonardo would understand it better. Leonardo da Vinci loved blurring reality with fantasy.
But it can't be your thing. I mean, you
Yeah.
do this painstaking literal research,
Right.
and then they take
so
liberties,
when I
right?
watch people blur fantasy with reality, I think, okay, it's not my thing, but they know what they're doing.
But you won't stipulate it like, hey, we'll get in there, but you got to put the water spirals in. I'll let you have it, but
No,
you got to.
for better or worse, when somebody buys the rights to the book, I almost stipulate that I don't have any involvement. In other words, I'm not one of these people who wants to be the producer of the movie because I know I'm not good at producing movies.
Have you ever been disappointed in an adaptation?
There are times when I keep saying, "Oh, well, that's not right," but I just have to restrain myself and say, "Oh, that's Hollywood."
That's very gracious of you to do that.
Well, I bite my tongue occasionally, but I am happy. I think Leonardo da Vinci would especially his rivalry with Michelangelo, his works with Machiavelli. There's so much in Leonardo's life that would just make a great movie. So I'm sure I'll love that movie.
Well, he's this mythical figure, you know. I mean, we see the huge sum being paid, as we mentioned, for the painting of his. Dan Brown was on the show not that long ago, and I mean, he wrote one of the biggest books in history, taking
Right.
advantage of some of the mythology.
And I love that because even though Dan Brown,
This is the Da Vinci Code, yeah.
right, blurs the distinction sometimes between reality and his mystery and the fantasies, it's a great yarn, which Leonardo would love because he wrote in his notebook wonderful tales that it's hard to tell. Is that something that really happened, or is that a fantasy of Leonardo da Vinci's? So that blurring is kind of good. Unfortunately, I'm just a nonfiction writer, so I try to stick with the facts.
Do you ever worry that that as we learn more about him, his mystique will fade?
Oh, no. The good thing about Leonardo is like the blurred lines in the faces of his paintings, there's always going to be a tiny bit of mystery around Leonardo. He embraced mystery in his life. There's, mysterious things about him. But that mystery comes through in the art. It comes through in the science. And I would guess one of the great lessons of his life is that we have to be excited about embracing mystery. We shouldn't flinch from mystery.
Is this something you like in researching Leonardo da Vinci, Steve Jobs, Benjamin Franklin, Albert Einstein, these people? Is there anything that you change in your everyday life? I think we've been talking about some of the more theoretical lessons and the way you approach your life. Is there anything you change in your everyday life from learning from these people?
Especially with Leonardo da Vinci, deeply changed my life in sort of simple ways.
How?
Well, if I look at his questions, like why is the sky blue, or why does light hit ripples of water and the luster moves differently from the rest of the light, or why does water form a swirl when it goes into a basin or a bowl or a sink? Suddenly, I get up in the morning and I watch the water going into the sink, and I look at the swirl, or I'll watch a bird as he did to figure out whether the wings go up faster or down faster when the bird is flying. And these are simple things and so when I'm walking over here and it's sort of drizzling today, I look at the mist and I see how it makes something in the distance look blurrier, and that helps us with our perspective, just like he would in a painting. But in his notebook, he writes about the perspective of how things become mistier. It makes you understand the distance better. And so in our daily lives, even as we walk into this building, into this studio, we can just look around and look at a tiny sliver of blue sky and then the misty rain and be curious about it all.
Benjamin Franklin, Albert Einstein, Henry Kissinger, Leonardo da Vinci. Anyone
Don't
else?
forget Steve Jobs.
Steve Jobs. Anyone else come to mind? Any women come to mind? Anyone come to
Well,
mind?
I did do Ada Lovelace, and she's the framing device of a book I have called The Innovators, which was a few years ago, which is about the invention of the digital age. And she was Lord Byron's daughter and helped come up with the concept of the first general-purpose computer. She loved poetry like her father, but her mother was a mathematician. She combines the two, as we were talking about. And so it didn't sustain a whole biography because she didn't leave notebooks. There's not a huge amount known, but I tried to do a book with her as the device that held it together. And there are other women that I would think about doing in the future, but I don't think I'm going to do another great genius biography. It's like when you climb Mount Leonardo, you're not sure I think I'm going to do a simpler book next.
Something Metallica.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to do a book about my hometown of New Orleans
Oh, that's pretty
and
cool.
why in the 1890s, when there was mixed creoles and race and different people of different classes, races, ethnic backgrounds, you invent jazz and you have that sort of creativity.
Walter Isaacson, thanks for coming in.